SPQR, 4 letters carved into the bones of an empire. You've seen them on crumbling ruins, ancient coins, even Hollywood's idea of Roman glory. But what if I told you that this symbol, supposedly representing the Roman people, was never really about them at all? It was a mask, a weapon, a carefully crafted illusion used by Rome's elite to justify expansion, silence rebellion, and crown power with the illusion of democracy. Because behind the grandeur of marble and marching legions, Rome's greatest empire wasn't just built with swords, it was built with symbols, and SPQR was the sharpest of them all. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History, and today we're peeling back the golden veneer to expose the dark secrets behind Rome's most enduring lie. It began not with conquest, but with consent, or at least the illusion of it. In the early days of the Roman Republic, around the 5th century BCE, power was a game of appearances. The Senate and the people of Rome, Senatus Populusque, Romanus, SPQR, were etched into every public decree, every victory arch, every battlefield standard. It sounded noble, equal, like a promise sealed in stone, but the truth was already warping behind the phrase. SPQR was born in the ashes of monarchy. After the last Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown, a new political experiment took his place, the Republic. It claimed to distribute power among elected magistrates and make decisions through senatorial deliberation. But real influence never truly left the hands of the patrician, elite old families with deep pockets, private armies, and ancestral grudges. Historians still debate whether Rome's early republic was ever more than an oligarchy in disguise. Tribunes were created to protect plebeian rights, but even their veto power was limited by violence and bribery. Votes were counted, yes, but the richest classes always got to vote first, shaping outcomes before the commoners even spoke, and yet SPQR made it all look legitimate. That was the brilliance of the symbol. It was everywhere, etched into bronze tablets in the Forum, painted on shields carried to distant frontiers, whispered in prayers to Mars before battles. The words cloaked the ambitions of generals, the schemes of senators, the suffering of slaves. No matter how brutal Rome's expansion, SPQR claimed it was for the people. By 396 BCE, Rome had just crushed the Etruscan city of Veii after a 10-year siege. Official reports framed it as a noble campaign of justice, endorsed by the Senate and demanded by the people. But in truth, it was about land, about wealth, about eliminating rivals, and it was decided by a few patricians in smoke-filled atriums, long before the people ever voted. Even stranger, SPQR began to appear on objects far removed from politics, bread loaves stamped with the letters, amphorae carrying state grain. It wasn't about communication anymore. It was branding, a constant reminder that everything from taxes to temples flowed from this divine union of Senate and people. But that union was fraying. In 37 BCE, the Licinian section laws were passed, supposedly to limit the power of patricians and grant plebeians access to high office. It was hailed as a triumph for the people, and SPQR banners filled the Forum. But behind closed doors, patricians adapted. They married into plebeian families. They bought votes. They turned tribunes into puppets. Reform became ritual, a way to release pressure without changing the system. Remember that detail, because it would repeat again and again. There's a lesser-known episode that says more than any official decree, the strange case of the crocodile fat sunscreen. Yes, you heard that right. A curious tale from the Second Punic War claims that Roman soldiers in Africa used a blend of olive oil and crocodile fat as protection against the sun. While no official records confirm this, the story lingers in fragments of folklore, perhaps more metaphor than fact. But even its telling reflects something real. The Senate's obsession with optics, with projecting Roman ingenuity in every corner of conquest. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had become an empire in all but name. Provinces stretched from Spain to Asia Minor. Yet the Republic still clung to its symbols. SPQR was invoked to justify tax levies, conscription, and grain seizures. It was a veil that covered exploitation, offering the poor just enough bread and spectacle to keep them quiet. And then came the populace, those who learned to weaponize SPQR not just for conquest abroad, but for rebellion at home. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, were the first. They stood before the people, invoked SPQR, and demanded land reforms. Their crime wasn't greed, it was exposing the lie that SPQR no longer represented the people, if it ever had. Both were killed. Their blood washed the steps of the Senate. Officially, their deaths were necessary for the preservation of the Republic. But ask yourself, who got to define Republic? Who got to decide what SPQR meant? Not the people. That's the part that lingers. SPQR was never a fixed truth. It was a moving target, a banner that changed hands depending on who shouted it loudest. In time, one man would shout it louder than them all. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and he understood what SPQR truly was. Not a government, but a stage. Not a promise, but a prop. Julius Caesar didn't arrive in history as a conqueror, he arrived as a performer. He was born in 100 BCE into the Julian clan, one of the oldest patrician families in Rome, noble by name but far from wealthy. From the start, Caesar learned to weaponize perception. He dressed modestly in public, but whispered grand promises in private. He flattered the poor and charmed the Senate. And everywhere he went, he carried the phrase SPQR like a banner of virtue. But Caesar saw what others pretended not to. SPQR was hollow. The Republic had rotted from the inside. Votes were bought, grain was hoarded, and Senate seats were traded like favors. While the elite feasted behind guarded villas, the people starved beneath cracked tenement roofs. The illusion was crumbling, and illusions, Caesar knew, were ripe for capture. He began with spectacle. As aedile, he bankrupted himself to throw Rome's grandest public games. Gladiator matches, theatrical plays, mock naval battles, the kind of distractions that made the masses forget their hunger. And over every banner, every stage, every ticket, stub, SPQR. The Senate tried to reprimand him for the extravagance, but it was too late. The people were hooked, and Caesar had learned a crucial lesson. If SPQR meant the people, then whoever owned the people owned the symbol. Soon he moved into politics. His alliance with Crassus and Pompey, the so-called First Triumvirate, was unofficial, even illegal. But it gave Caesar what he needed: money, muscle, and legitimacy. He ran for consul in 59 BCE on a platform of land reform and debt relief, all under the cry of SPQR. His opponents tried to block him with procedural tricks, so he brought in guards, flooded the streets with supporters, pushed his legislation through by force of popularity. And the people cheered. Historians still debate whether Caesar was a champion of the people or a manipulator of their hopes. What's clear is that he turned SPQR into a weapon of persuasion. Every speech he gave began with the phrase. Every decree he issued bore the seal. But the decisions, they were his. He had found the secret. If the crowd believed it was their will, no one questioned the hand guiding it. In 58 BCE, Caesar left for Gaul. Officially, he was governor, tasked with protecting Roman territory. In reality, he launched one of the most brutal and ambitious conquests in Roman history. For nearly a decade, he waged war across France, Belgium, and even into Britain. He slaughtered tribes, enslaved survivors, and looted unimaginable wealth. Yet every dispatch he sent back to Rome began the same way. In the name of SPQR, it was propaganda at its finest. Back home, the Senate grew anxious. Caesar was too powerful, too popular, too independent, and worst of all, he still spoke as if he served the Republic. He had made SPQR synonymous with himself. A curious episode occurred in 55 BCE, often overlooked. Caesar, preparing for a campaign in Britain, reportedly ordered a massive wooden bridge built across the Rhine not to cross, but to prove it could be done. The bridge was a message, not a tactic. It was constructed, crossed, and torn down in a matter of days. The point wasn't military, it was symbolic. It told Gaul, Germany, and Rome that Caesar and, by extension, SPQR could go anywhere, do anything, and leave no trace but awe. But not everyone was awed. Back in Rome, the Senate passed a motion demanding Caesar disband his army before returning. They feared his popularity, feared what he might do with it. Caesar's term as governor had ended. Tradition and law required him to surrender command. But Caesar understood the stage. He knew that SPQR had become a script one where he played both hero and savior. So instead of obeying, he wrote a new ending, one drenched in drama, myth, and irreversible consequence. As his legions stood on the banks of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, the boundary of lawful military command, he paused. History doesn't record the precise words he spoke, only that he crossed, with his army, with intent, with SPQR emblazoned on many of the standards as it always was. But now those four letters no longer stood for shared governance. They stood for him. It was not just a military decision, it was theater. A declaration to the people that he was not attacking Rome, he was returning to restore it. That those who resisted him were enemies of SPQR. And the people believed him. Crowds welcomed him in cities along the way. Some senators fled. Others switched sides. Those who resisted were painted as tyrants, aristocrats clinging to broken systems. Caesar had flipped the narrative. He was no longer a general violating tradition. He was SPQR incarnate, a figure whose rise would echo across the entire history of the Roman Empire. The Rubicon was more than a river. It was a Rubicon in the soul of Rome. Once crossed, there was no turning back. Not for Caesar, not for the Republic, not for the symbol that had held it all together. SPQR. Rome didn't fall in a blaze that day. It unraveled in silence. As Caesar marched southward, towns opened their gates without resistance. Governors defected. Armies surrendered. His reputation, amplified by years of self-penned reports and heroic tales, had made him invincible in the minds of many. And each act of submission was cloaked in the same justification, for the preservation of SPQR. But inside the Senate chambers, SPQR was cracking. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now led the resistance. He fled Rome with a handful of senators, vowing to defend the Republic from Caesar's tyranny. He claimed Caesar's use of SPQR was false, blasphemous even. But few listened. The streets were filled with Caesar's supporters, many of whom had never seen the Senate do anything for them. Historians still debate whether this was the moment democracy died. Some say it had already rotted beyond saving. Others claim it could have been salvaged. But the question that lingered wasn't what is the Republic? It was who gets to define it. That's when Caesar gave the people an answer by writing it in blood. The civil war that followed stretched across 3 continents. Spain, Greece, North Africa. Cities burned, legions betrayed each other, and whole provinces shifted allegiance overnight. Every commander claimed to fight for SPQR. Every coin minted during the war bore its letters, even as brothers killed brothers beneath its banner. There was one particularly eerie event in 48 BCE, lesser known, but chilling in hindsight. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium, Caesar narrowly escaped defeat. Some later sources claim he shouted to his fleeing soldiers, "Do you want to hand me over to the Senate?" A cry more symbolic than recorded, if it ever happened at all. Still, it captures the growing absurdity of a republic that could neither fight him nor define him. Later that year at Pharsalus, Caesar crushed Pompey's forces. The senators who had opposed him lay dead or captured. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated before he could regroup. And Caesar, ever the performer, wept at the sight of his rival's severed head. Publicly, he condemned the murder. Privately, he had removed the last credible threat to his dominance. But what made Caesar different was not just his victory, it was how he explained it. He didn't abolish the Republic. He didn't crown himself king. He returned to Rome and declared once again that all he had done was in service of SPQR, that the war had been necessary to protect the people from corruption and disorder. To many, this was a relief. The chaos had ended. Bread flowed again. The games returned. Statues of Caesar sprang up, often placed beside SPQR monuments, merging the two into a single image, Caesar as the living embodiment of the Republic. Then came the titles: Dictator, Tribune, Pontifex Maximus. None of them hereditary, all of them constitutional technically. But the Senate no longer resisted. It applauded. It offered Caesar honors, some of which he modestly refused, only to accept others twice as great. In 44 BCE, he was declared dictator in perpetuity. And still the letters SPQR loomed over every ceremony, every festival, every decree. It was now a seal of divine approval. And that frightened the few who still remembered the Republic as more than a performance. There was a phrase whispered in backrooms during this time. He acts as if Rome were his inheritance, not his charge, not his duty, his inheritance. On the Ides of March, a group of senators decided to put an end to that. They were men from old families. Some had fought beside Caesar, others had benefited from his rule. But all agreed on one thing: if Caesar became king, the Republic would die. And so they turned to the very language he had co-opted. They claimed to act in the name of SPQR. On March 15, 44 BCE, they struck. Inside the theater of Pompey, under the pretense of honoring tradition, they stabbed him 23 times. No legion stood in their way. No crowd intervened. The man who had rewritten Rome's narrative with symbols and spectacle died in silence, at the feet of a statue of Pompey, his old rival. The irony was surgical. The senators emerged from the building shouting, "Liberty! Liberty!" as if they had just liberated SPQR from a tyrant. But no one rushed to embrace them. The people mourned. The streets did not rejoice. In killing Caesar, the Senate had not restored SPQR. They had exposed it. They had revealed that the Republic, as people once imagined it, no longer existed. All that remained was a hollow phrase own Caesar had filled with meaning, even if that meaning was his own image. And now, with Caesar dead, a new question arose. Who would inherit that image? Caesar's body was still warm when the myth-making began. His assassins had counted on the people to celebrate his death. Instead, Rome held its breath and then it wept. In their attempt to restore the Republic, the senators had misjudged something vital. Caesar hadn't just ruled Rome, he had performed Rome, and the people had believed the performance. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, wasted no time. He arranged a public funeral, not a modest affair, not a quiet procession, but a spectacle, one last act worthy of Caesar's legend. During the oration, Antony pointed to the bloody toga, to Caesar's wounds, to the unarmed man who had fallen not in battle, but at the hands of those who claimed to represent SPQR. Then came the masterstroke. Antony read Caesar's will aloud. It left money to every Roman citizen. It promised public parks, grain subsidies, and continued games. And with every word, the crowd grew more restless. SPQR hadn't done this. The Senate hadn't done this. Caesar had. In death, he had outmaneuvered them once more. And then something no one expected. A comet. Just days after the funeral, a blazing light streaked across the sky during the Ludi Victoriae Caesaris, games held in his honor. The people called it the Julian Star, a sign from the heavens, an omen. They said it was Caesar's soul ascending to join the gods. Antony seized the moment. He strongly implied Caesar's divinity, calling on omens, the Julian Star, and the will of the people. The formal deification came later, through Senate decree. But the seed was planted here, in the roar of the crowd and the smoke of incense. Not just a great man, not just a martyr for SPQR, but a god. And himself, the voice of that god. The Republic didn't burn that day. It evaporated in incense. Even stranger was what came next. The letters SPQR remained on buildings, on coins, on military banners. But now they stood beneath Caesar's name. The Senate and the people had become endorsers of the divine. The symbol hadn't been retired, it had been baptized. Historians still debate whether this moment marks the true end of the Roman Republic. Some point to the earlier civil war, others to Caesar's appointment as dictator for life. But many agree that deifying Caesar crossed a new boundary. The Republic had once executed kings, now it worshipped one. But even gods leave power vacuums. Enter Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son named as heir in his will. At just 18 years old, he was quiet, untested, and seemingly harmless. But beneath that calm exterior was someone who had studied Caesar's playbook page by page. Octavian didn't seize power immediately. He played the long game. He kept SPQR close to his chest, using it as both shield and sword. When Antony aligned with Cleopatra, Octavian painted him as a traitor to Rome, seduced by a foreign queen. He flooded the streets with images, coins bearing SPQR, and Octavian's face side by side, statues of Caesar with stars overhead, and whispered promises that he alone could avenge his divine father. In the name of SPQR, it worked. The Senate granted him extraordinary powers, not in defiance of tradition, but in defense of it. His enemies called him a tyrant, but to the people he was a healer, a restorer, the man who would finally bring peace after years of chaos. In 31 BCE, Octavian crushed Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. When he returned to Rome, he didn't claim a throne, he claimed humility. He offered to relinquish his powers. The Senate refused. They gave him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. He accepted, not a crown, not a title of king, something more elusive, an aura of sanctity. He positioned himself not above the Republic, but as its guardian. And so, across the entire history of the Roman Empire, SPQR lived on, engraved in stone, embroidered on standards, etched into laws. But now it meant something else, something slippery. Augustus ruled absolutely, yet always invoked SPQR. Laws were passed by the Senate and the people. Armies marched under its banner, but no decision was made without Augustus's nod. There's a strange but telling detail from this era. Augustus insisted that senators and magistrates always refer to him indirectly, never as ruler, never as king, only as princeps, first citizen. He understood what Caesar had missed. You didn't need to destroy the illusion, you could inhabit it. He built temples to Caesar, reformed the calendar, enshrined himself in myth, and over it all, SPQR still stood, like an empty theater curtain hiding a one-man show. By now, the phrase no longer meant shared governance. It meant obedience. It meant continuity. It meant the appearance of choice, in a world where choice had already been decided. And the people, they preferred it that way. The bread returned. The games grew larger. The taxes were predictable. The streets were safer. All Augustus had to do was never remove the mask. SPQR had become a ghost, a phantom limb of a republic long since severed, but still twitching, still remembered, still believed in. The Senate no longer ruled. The people no longer decided, but the letters remained. Augustus reigned for over 4 decades. By the time he died in 14 CE, the Roman people could barely recall a time before him. The Republic, if it ever truly existed, was now myth. In SPQR, it had become something stranger still. A sacred relic. No longer a political formula, now a divine signature. But the empire marched on. Each new emperor, from Tiberius to Nero, Claudius to Hadrian, inherited the stage that Augustus built. They wore its costumes, quoted its scripts, and above all, they wielded SPQR like a holy seal. Coins still bore the letters, monuments still praised the Senate and the people, but the people had no voice. The Senate had no power. A strange transformation had taken place. SPQR, once the symbol of shared rule, had become the ultimate justification of power. Need to raise taxes? SPQR commands it. Need to invade a neighboring kingdom? SPQR decrees it. Need to silence dissent? SPQR defends the peace. The symbol was so powerful, so deeply ingrained, that no emperor dared discard it even as they ruled with unchecked authority. There's a little-known incident from the reign of Caligula around 39 CE that reveals just how performative SPQR had become. During Caligula's reign around 39 CE, he infamously ordered a statue of himself placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a move that nearly sparked revolt. Official justification was rooted in imperial authority, but later whispers suggest he cloaked it, at least rhetorically, in the language of SPQR. Whether that phrase was ever spoken remains uncertain, but the message was clear. The Republic's name could now bless even blasphemy. The act nearly triggered revolt. But what's fascinating isn't just the arrogance, it's the language. Caligula didn't claim divine right for himself alone. He invoked the Senate and the people, two institutions that neither debated nor approved the move. SPQR had become a rhetorical ghost, a stamp of moral certainty, even in the face of madness. And that madness would deepen. In the years that followed, emperors were made and unmade by the military. Legions declared loyalty not to the Senate, not even to Rome, but to individuals who promised spoils, security, and spectacle. And yet, when these new rulers seized power, what did they do? They minted coins with SPQR. They restored temples in its name. They told the people, nothing has changed. And that was the brilliance and tragedy of it all. SPQR was no longer a system of governance. It was a brand, a relic, a superstition, but a useful one. Historians still debate why the illusion endured for so long. Was it fear? Was it apathy? Or was it simply that Rome, in all its chaos and glory, had learned to worship the mask more than the face beneath it? Even during the crisis of the 3rd century, when emperors were assassinated in rapid succession, when provinces broke away, when plagues ravaged the cities, the letters SPQR remained. The Republic had vanished, but its ghost still stamped imperial edicts, because symbols once ingrained no longer need substance. They become sacred. And so, Rome endured, its people believing they still held power, its Senate pretending it still ruled, its emperors cloaked in modesty while holding the world in their palms. The Republic became empire, the citizen became spectator, and SPQR became silence. And now, as we leave the dust of fallen columns and fading marble behind, one truth lingers longer than the wars, the murders, the grand declarations. Rome didn't fall in a single day. It faded like a shadow behind stained glass, because the most powerful empires don't collapse in flames. They transform slowly, subtly across the entire history of the Roman Empire. They exchange swords for symbols, tyranny for ritual, reality for performance. And SPQR, it was the finest performance of all. A 4-letter spell whispered through time. It told the people they mattered, even as they were marched to the games. It told the Senate it ruled, even as it rubber-stamped a monarch's will. It told the world that conquest was civilization. And even now, millennia later, the echoes remain. In architecture, in mottos, in governments that still claim to speak for the people while acting in shadows. So if you ever see those letters on a building, a seal, a flag, pause. Ask not what they once meant. Ask who is speaking through them now, because symbols survive, even when the republics behind them do not. This has been Shadows of Ancient History, a place where the masks are older than the men who wear them, and the ghosts speak louder than the living.